There is a quiet crisis unfolding beneath the surface of the modern world, and almost nobody is talking about it at dinner. The United Nations has estimated that roughly 1/3 of the Earth's topsoil has already been degraded, and at current rates of erosion and chemical depletion, many of the world's most productive agricultural regions could lose their ability to grow food within the next 60 years. Industrial farming, with its monocultures, synthetic fertilizers, deep mechanical plowing, and relentless pressure to extract maximum yield from every square metre, has accomplished something that no ancient empire, no drought, and no plague ever managed to do. It has begun to kill the soil itself, and yet 3,000 years ago, on the rocky, rain-dependent hillsides of ancient Canaan, a nation of former slaves built an agricultural system so resilient, so attuned to the biology of the ground beneath their feet, that it sustained continuous harvests across centuries without a single bag of synthetic nitrogen, without a tractor, and without any of the industrial infrastructure we now consider essential to feeding a population. The Israelites were not agronomists in the modern sense. They did not publish papers or measure soil pH, but they followed a set of instructions, given directly by God, codified in the Torah, and reinforced by the rhythms of their religious calendar, that aligned so precisely with what modern soil science now understands about nutrient cycling, microbial health, and organic matter management that it reads less like ancient religion and more like an advanced ecology textbook written in the language of covenant and commandment. The year the land breathed, the most radical agricultural law in the entire Old Testament, appears in Leviticus chapter 25, beginning at verse 2, where God tells Moses to instruct the people that when they enter the land he is giving them, the land itself shall observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years they were permitted to sow their fields, prune their vineyards, and gather their crops, but in the 7th year the land was to have a complete rest. No sowing, no pruning, no organised harvesting. Whatever grew on its own could be eaten, but the farmer was forbidden from working the soil. The Hebrew word used is shemitah, meaning release, and it applied not only to the fields but to debts and obligations as well, creating a total economic and ecological reset every 7 years. To a modern agricultural economist, the idea of voluntarily idling an entire nation's farmland for a full year sounds like economic suicide. But to a soil scientist, it sounds like genius. Fallow periods allow depleted soils to recover critical nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, through natural biological processes. When a field is left unplanted, native grasses and leguminous weeds colonize the surface, and their root systems begin pulling atmospheric nitrogen into the soil through symbiotic relationships with rhizobium bacteria. Organic matter from decaying plant residue feeds the microbial communities that drive nutrient cycling, and the absence of tillage allows the soil structure to rebuild, restoring the pore spaces and aggregates that hold water and air in the root zone. The Israelites practiced this on a national scale, simultaneously, across the entire land, which means the 7th year was not merely a field-level strategy, but a landscape-level restoration event. And the law did not stop at 7. Leviticus chapter 25 goes further, describing the Jubilee year, the 50th year, following 7 cycles of 7, in which the land rested again, all property reverted to its original tribal allocation, and the entire agricultural and economic system was, in effect, rebooted. No ancient civilization on Earth had anything remotely comparable. The Babylonians rotated crops, the Egyptians relied on the Nile's annual flood to renew their fields. But only Israel embedded a mandatory divinely enforced rest cycle into the legal structure of the nation, treating the soil not as a resource to be consumed, but as a living participant in the covenant that deserved its own Sabbath, walls built from patience. If you have ever seen photographs of the Judean hill country, the rugged terrain stretching south from Jerusalem toward Hebron and east toward the Dead Sea, you may have noticed the ancient stone walls that climb the hillsides in long curving lines, turning steep slopes into a staircase of flat, plantable surfaces. These are agricultural terraces, and they are among the most enduring physical monuments to Israelite farming ingenuity. Archaeological surveys have identified terrace systems across the central highlands of Israel that date to the Iron Age, the period of the Israelite settlement, and many of them were still in use, or still visible, more than 2,000 years after they were first constructed. Terracing accomplished several things simultaneously that no other single technique could replicate. First, it converted land that was otherwise too steep to farm into productive agricultural space, effectively expanding the arable territory of the highland settlements without requiring conquest or migration. Second, the stone walls acted as retaining structures that captured rainwater runoff, slowing its descent down the hillside and allowing it to soak into the soil behind each terrace wall, rather than sheeting off the surface and carrying the topsoil with it. In a region where rainfall was seasonal and unpredictable, concentrated in the winter months and entirely absent through the long dry summer, every drop of water that could be held in the soil was the difference between a harvest and a failure. Third, and perhaps most critically for long-term soil health, the terraces created sediment traps. As water slowed behind each wall, it deposited the fine particles of silt and organic matter it had been carrying, gradually building up layers of rich, dark soil in the planting beds. Over decades and centuries, these terrace soils became deeper and more fertile than anything the original hillside could have supported, and the archaeological evidence suggests that the Israelite farmers understood this process and actively managed it, clearing sediment from drainage channels, repairing walls after winter storms, and adding organic material to the terrace beds to accelerate the enrichment. Deuteronomy chapter 11 verses 10 through 12 draws an explicit contrast between the agricultural systems of Egypt, where the land was watered by irrigation from the Nile and the farmer's foot, and the land of Canaan, which drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land that the Lord your God cares for, with his eyes always upon it from the beginning of the year to the end. The terraces were, in a very real sense, the physical infrastructure through which the Israelites received that rain, catching and holding what God sent from above in stone vessels built by human hands, what the flocks left behind. The average Israelite household kept animals, sheep, goats, cattle and donkeys, with a backbone of the pastoral economy that ran alongside the agricultural one, and the two systems were not separate enterprises, but deeply interlocking parts of a single ecological cycle. The animals grazed on the stubble left in the fields after harvest, clearing plant residue and controlling weeds, and in return they deposited their dung directly onto the soil, replenishing the organic matter and nutrients that the crops had consumed during the growing season. This was not incidental, it was managed, and it was essential. Archaeological excavations at sites across ancient Israel have uncovered dense accumulations of animal dung in agricultural contexts, and phytolith analysis of these deposits has confirmed that livestock were systematically folded onto harvested fields, meaning they were penned or shepherded onto specific plots in rotation to concentrate their manure where it was most needed. The practice is described indirectly in Scripture through the constant association between flocks and fields, between the shepherd and the farmer, and through the sheer frequency with which livestock appear as markers of agricultural wealth. When Job's prosperity is catalogued in Job chapter 1, it includes 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, animals that would have produced enormous quantities of manure, all of which would have cycled back into the soil of his fields. Dung served multiple functions beyond simple fertilization. When dried, it was used as fuel for cooking fires, a practice still common in parts of the Middle East today, and the ash produced from burning dung was itself returned to the fields as a source of potassium and phosphorus. When composted in heaps alongside straw, food scraps, and other organic waste, animal dung underwent microbial decomposition that broke it down into humus, the dark, stable organic matter that gives healthy soil its structure, its water-holding capacity, and its ability to sustain root growth season after season. The prophet Isaiah uses the image of dung spread on a threshing floor in Isaiah chapter 25 verse 10, and while the context is a metaphor for divine judgment, the imagery would have been instantly recognizable to any Israelite farmer. Dung on the ground was not waste, it was wealth, the raw material from which next year's grain would grow. Ezekiel chapter 4 verse 15 records God permitting the prophet to use cow dung instead of human dung for fuel during a symbolic siege demonstration, which tells us that the distinction between types of dung and their appropriate uses was well understood and carefully observed in Israelite culture. The lentil's invisible gift. Among the staple crops of ancient Israel, wheat, barley, grapes, olives, figs, pomegranates, and dates, the 7 species listed in Deuteronomy chapter 8, there was another category of plants that rarely receives the attention it deserves, even though its contribution to the sustainability of the entire system may have been more fundamental than any of them. Lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, and bitter vetch were cultivated extensively across the ancient Near East, and in the Israelite agricultural calendar, they occupied a specific and critical role. They were the crops that gave back to the soil what the grain crops took out. Legumes belong to the family Fabaceae, and their defining biological feature is the ability to form symbiotic relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria of the genus Rhizobium, which colonize nodules on the plant's roots and convert atmospheric nitrogen, a gas that is abundant in the air but inaccessible to most plants, into ammonium, a form that plants can absorb and use to build proteins and grow. When a legume crop is harvested, the root nodules left behind in the soil release their stored nitrogen, effectively fertilizing the ground for the next crop planted in that field. This is the biological mechanism behind crop rotation, and the Israelites practiced it instinctively, alternating grain crops with legume crops in a rhythm that kept their soils productive without any external inputs. The evidence for this practice is both archaeological and scriptural. Lentils appear in some of the most vivid agricultural scenes in the Old Testament. Esau's famous exchange of his birthright for a bowl of red lentil stew in Genesis chapter 25, verse 34, places lentils at the center of a story about hunger, desperation, and the value of what grows from the ground. In Samuel chapter 23, verse 11, one of David's mighty warriors makes his stand in a field full of lentils, defending the crop against a Philistine raiding party, with enough ferocity to suggest that the lentil harvest was considered worth dying for. And archaeobotanical studies at Iron Age sites across Israel have consistently found lentils, chickpeas, and other legumes among the carbonized seed assemblages recovered from domestic storage contexts, confirming that these crops were grown widely and stored carefully alongside the primary grains. The Israelite farmer may not have known the word nitrogen, but he knew that planting lentils in a field one year made the barley grow taller the next. He knew that the soil in a bean field felt different under his feet, darker, richer, more alive, and he organized his planting accordingly. The rotation was not written down in Leviticus as a commandment, but it was embedded in the agricultural knowledge passed from father to son across generations, a tradition as durable as the terraces and as invisible as the bacteria that made it work. Reading the sky for grain. Everything in the Israelite agricultural system depended ultimately on water, and in Canaan, water meant rain. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile's annual inundation provided a predictable and controllable water supply, the land of Israel received its moisture from the sky in two distinct seasonal pulses that the Old Testament calls the early rain and the latter rain. The early rain, or yoreh, arrived in October and November, softening the sun-baked ground after the long summer drought, and signalling the farmer to begin ploughing and sowing his winter crops of wheat and barley. The latter rain, or malkosh, fell in March and April, filling out the grain heads in the critical weeks before harvest, and ensuring that the kernels were plump and mature when the sickle came. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 and 14, ties these rains directly to the covenant. If you will diligently obey my commandments which I command you today, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, I will give the rain of your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, and your wine, and your oil. The rain was not merely a meteorological event, it was a theological one, a tangible expression of God's faithfulness to a people who depended on him for every mouthful of bread they ate. And when the rains failed, as they did periodically, the consequences were immediate and devastating, producing the famines that drive so many of the narrative arcs in Genesis, Ruth, and Kings. And the Israelite farmer's entire calendar was organized around these two rain windows. Plowing began after the early rains had moistened the upper layers of the soil, using a simple wooden scratch plow pulled by a pair of oxen, a tool that broke the surface crust and opened shallow furrows without inverting the soil profile the way a modern moldboard plow does. This shallow tillage preserved the deeper soil structure, maintained the networks of mycorrhizal fungi that help plant roots access phosphorus and micronutrients, and minimized the disruption to the microbial communities that drive organic matter decomposition. The Israelite plough was, by modern conservation agriculture standards, almost ideally designed for the light calcareous soils of the Judean highlands. The Giza calendar, a small limestone tablet discovered in 1908 at the ancient site of Giza and dated to approximately the 10th century before the Common Era, provides the earliest known written record of the Israelite agricultural year. Inscribed in early Hebrew script, it divides the year into 8 periods defined by agricultural activities: 2 months of ingathering, 2 months of sowing, 2 months of late planting, 1 month of hoeing flax, 1 month of barley harvest, 1 month of wheat harvest, 2 months of pruning, and 1 month of summer fruit. The calendar reveals a people whose entire conception of time was organised not around political events or abstract dates, but around the rhythms of the soil, the needs of the crops, and the arrival of the rains that made it all possible, the edges they refused to touch. There is one more law in the Israelite agricultural code that is almost always discussed in terms of social justice, but rarely examined for its ecological consequences, and it may be the most quietly brilliant piece of soil management in the entire Torah. Leviticus chapter 19 verses 9 and 10 commands the Israelite farmer not to harvest the corners of his field, and not to go back for the gleanings, the scattered stalks, and dropped grain left behind after the first pass of the harvest. These were to be left for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner, and the law appears again in Deuteronomy chapter 24, where it is extended to olive trees and vineyards as well. The social dimension of this law is extraordinary in its own right. It created a permanent decentralized food security system for the most vulnerable members of Israelite society, funded not by taxation, but by the unharvested margins of every field in the nation. The Book of Ruth is built entirely around this practice, as Ruth the Moabite gleans in the fields of Boaz during the barley harvest in Ruth chapter 2, gathering the leftovers that the law required him to leave behind. But the ecological consequences of the gleaning laws deserve equal attention, because by leaving the field edges and the dropped grain unharvested, the Israelite farmer was also leaving organic matter on the soil surface, stalks, chaff, fallen seeds, and root systems that would decompose in place and return their nutrients directly to the ground. Modern conservation agriculture calls this practice residue retention, and it is considered one of the most effective strategies for maintaining soil organic carbon, reducing erosion, and supporting the microbial ecosystems that drive soil fertility. The unharvested corners functioned as permanent buffer strips, areas where wild grasses, flowering plants, and volunteer legumes could establish themselves, providing habitat for pollinating insects, stabilizing the soil at the field margins where erosion pressure was highest, and creating reservoirs of biological diversity that could recolonize the cultivated areas after each growing season. The gleaning laws also had the effect of preventing the kind of extractive, maximum yield mentality that destroys soil over time. The farmer was commanded, in essence, to leave something behind, to acknowledge that the field was not his to strip bare, that its productivity was a gift held in trust, and that the land's needs and the poor person's needs both took precedence over his desire to squeeze every last sheaf of grain from the harvest. It was an institutionalized restraint, a built-in check against the greed that turns fertile ground into dust, and it operated at every level simultaneously: social, ecological, and spiritual. When you step back and see it whole, the seventh year rest. The terraces holding rain in stone arms, the animals cycling nutrients back into the soil they had grazed, the lentils quietly fixing nitrogen in the dark below the surface, the farmer reading the sky for the early and the latter rain, and the unharvested edges feeding both the poor and the ground itself. What emerges is not a collection of primitive techniques, but a complete self-sustaining agricultural ecology. Every element supported every other element. The animals fed on the stubble fed the animals, the dung fed the soil fed the grain fed the family, and the seventh year allowed the entire system to catch its breath and begin again. And none of it was invented by the farmers themselves. The laws came from Sinai, delivered by the same God who had designed the nitrogen cycle and the rain patterns and the bacterial symbiosis in the first place. The Israelite farmer did not need to understand the microbiology. He needed to obey the instructions, and the instructions, it turns out, were written by someone who understood the microbiology perfectly. In a world now scrambling to reverse the damage of 2 centuries of industrial extraction from the soil, that ancient system of commanded restraint, cyclical rest, and cooperative ecology looks less like a relic and more like a blueprint that we abandoned at our own peril.